Greg's a tough act to follow. I mean, from 1491 to rooftop gardens. I'm not so sure how this is all going to work out, but I don't think I can kind of match the breadth of the presentation you just heard. What I'm going to try to do, Doug gave me a call to talk here. I was trying to think of what might be most interesting to discuss. And I thought, I could talk about a particular area, and as I thought about it, that's probably going to be outdated by the time I get here. So what I thought I would do is talk about what kind of a typical, whether there's a typical, practitioner in this area does. What are the issues that at least maybe atypical, deal with day to day, and trying to figure out kind of the policy and the finance and the technology questions around renewable policy. So what I'm going to do, and I don't have any fancy pictures like Greg does, you're really putting me to shame here, Greg. And let me give you the perspective here, and then I'll give you the issues. So what I do kind of day to day, as running a couple nonprofits in this area, is try to advance clean energy around the country, some international work as well. And through two organizations. One is more of a research organization, Clean Energy Group. The other, Clean Energy States Alliance, really works with the states, and that's our focus. And then these are the states that have typically public money that they invest in these technologies. So everything from California to New York to Massachusetts and others. And these guys have been in the lead for quite a while. So that's, my perspective is more of a state one, not DC. In fact, not much DC at all, which is just fine with me. And so, particularly in these days, where there's a lot of not happening down there, so the states are really where the action is. So what I'm going to give you is just this kind of smorgasbord of issues, kind of dip in a little bit and tell you what these are about. And these are the kind of issues that maybe a typical or atypical advocate in this area deals with day to day. And these are kind of the current issues that are kicking around in the space, and why some of it's very hard to get done, and why some of it holds out some promise for the future. I won't go through this list because I'll do it one by one, and you'll see these slides as well. This is really a chart that basically says, and there's a report a week that has a chart like this, but what it basically says is that if you're going to stabilize emissions over the next 40 or 50 or 60 years, you have to do it with a mix of many different technologies, and they range from renewables to, in some cases, nuclear, gas, and then the role of oil and biomass. And don't take this one as gospel at all, and it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. I had to actually look up what each A meant, which is exajoules, which is a lot of energy that the planet actually has to expend to make the world go. But what this basically highlights is that when we're talking about climate stabilization over the long term, we're really talking about a balancing act of how to scale up the no or low carbon emissions, and obviously how to scale down on those that produce emissions today. And this is the main takeaway from this is that this is a lift of unimaginable proportions, and that is by 2050 you basically have to have an energy system worldwide that produces zero emissions in order to start bending the curve over the long run. It's an extraordinary transition that we need to go through, but that's the challenge. And you can, some of these I think sites are at the end if you actually want to look at this and see if this makes any sense to you. So that's the why, and that's at least what we do, and that's what we're trying to get to. What's happening within the industry, and these are just, again, a couple examples of what's happening. And the one on the left, to your left, is the trend line for solar panels in the last several years. And what you see is a pretty good trend down. That is, the cost per watt of solar panels worldwide has dropped pretty dramatically. And then on the other side, on the right, you see, at least in the US side, fairly dramatic increase in the number of installations of solar worldwide. solar company in China has gone bankrupt. And the level of subsidy that the Chinese have provided to their solar industry is declining precipitously. China's starting to face some of the same debt problems that we have, or don't have, assuming the numbers. But what that means is that we probably have enjoyed in the last couple of years, maybe, an artificially induced, heavily subsidized reduction in the cost of solar. A lot of the U.S. installations that you see on the right have been done, many of them at least, with Chinese panels. So the question is whether this is a blip, whether this is a trend. It's unclear, but I think it's just an issue to be mindful of, and whether this is a sustainable trend over the long run, or whether it was a result of fairly short-term Chinese industrial policy to boost solar exports from China that may be sacrificed to some of their internal economic problems. We'll have to see. Obviously problematic if that's true. And obviously a lot of the U.S. manufacturers, because of the heavily subsidized Chinese play in the last several years, have gone under. So, the double whammy here could be that we've lost some U.S. manufacturing capacity, thinking that that's okay because the numbers will go down, when in fact, if the Chinese numbers go down as well from the manufacturing side, we're in a bit of trouble. So that's an issue to worry about, because the main challenge here is that you want to get the cost of whether it's solar or wind or biomass or whatever it is down, right? That's the whole idea. You want to make it competitive with, and I'll talk a little bit about gas, but you want to make it competitive with the fossil fuels that now dominate the system. And if you don't make it competitive, you can't subsidize this stuff forever. So that's the challenge. You got to get it down. You want those lines to cross so that you're under your competition. Again, easier said than done. The result of this is we've had a lot of activity in the U.S. This is maybe a complicated chart, but basically what you see is there's been a lot of natural gas projects that have been installed. This is December 2012, look up there. And wind, you have more wind domestically that's been put online than natural gas. Solar is way down because of what's called capacity factor. You may have a lot of solar, but it's not that efficient. But anyway, it's an interesting snapshot as to where the mix is right now and where we're heading. A lot more of this stuff, particularly wind and solar, than we had 10 years ago, nowhere near where you need to be, and you're still running up against a lot of fairly serious competition. And this is one of the issues. And all this reflects, and this is just a chart that indicates what's happening with gas prices. And you probably have read the news about fracking, gas fracking, pretty controversial technique. But what it underscores is that natural gas is a very predominant part of the U.S. energy picture. And what it's doing, and this is the gas-coal comparison, is that because natural gas has been so cheap, it's knocking out a lot of coal plants. That is, coal, what used to be the cheapest baseload generation. And so gas is knocking that out. Not consistently, but when you see these numbers where gas is under the coal price, you're starting to see coal becoming uneconomic. Same thing with nuclear plants. A lot of the nuclear heyday of 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, where it was always the next. Nuclear is always going to basically almost come back, and then the economics get it when a competition comes in, and that's what's happening here too. Now, that you may think that's great, that gas is knocking out coal and gas is knocking out nuclear, but at the same time, it's making it really hard for renewables because if it's cheaper than coal, it's a lot cheaper than solar. Wind sometimes is close. So again, just to highlight this issue, at the end of the day, people like Jim and others have to get financing for projects, whether it's solar projects or wind projects. And if the economics don't pan out, you're not going to get these projects installed. And so this is a very important thing to happen. depending on where you fall out on the gas issue, there's obviously a lot of controversy about this, but at the end of the day, if you're really thinking about the 50-year play, this is really critically important about how this competition works out and who's going to win the game. So that's one issue. You see that it's cut off a little bit. What that says is existing versus new technology debate. This is another one of these issues in the kind of the renewable field that I think is kind of this phony argument, it's a phony debate, but it's there. And that is, the question is this: if we're going to get to, in 50 years, some zero carbon emissions at some point with some mix of technologies that we talked about in the beginning, how do you do it? Can you just scale up what we've got? You kind of take what you have and say basically, look, if you have way more wind, way more solar, way more biomass, we can get there from there. So it's just a matter of political will. That's an argument that you hear repeatedly. The contrary point of view is the first, and that is you can scale all this up, and that's great, but it's not going to be enough. That you need to have some significant breakthroughs and some key technologies to actually get there, to get to a point of having, bending that arc of emissions over time, over 30 or 40 years. And it sounds like sort of a silly debate, but if you're in this field, it's a constant debate because it's one of political will. If only people have political will versus now, if you have the political will, you actually have to do some very serious technology innovation, technology breakthroughs going forward, in things like storage and other technologies. You need to have breakthroughs. You need to have some new stuff happening. And that's why there's so much pressure and concern about U.S. reducing its investment in energy technology innovation, energy R&D. As we do that, you make it much, much harder to actually achieve anything going forward over a 50-year period. Again, it's an interesting debate. I think the one on top has the better of the argument. It's a new piece that came out on the breakthrough side. Worth looking at. If you're kind of interested in this field, student looking at what are the issues coming out, this is clearly one of them. Another one is what's the role of the federal government versus the state, and this remains a constant battle, particularly as you see in Washington, basically gridlock, stalemate. You really can't make much progress at all in this area. It's not like all hope is lost, because basically what's really been happening in the last 10 or 15 years, and a lot of this work that CLF and Doug and others did, have been doing for 20 to 25 years, is that, at the end of the day, at the federal level, energy has always been gridlocked. It's not like there was ever a great time at the federal level where there was consensus on these issues. This is a regionally split area. You've got oil sectors, you've got other sectors. So at the end of the day, in this area, the states have really been the leaders. From Mass, California, New York, that's been the case. And so, 15 years ago, a lot of them said, we're going to put up public money to do this. So you have the Mass Clean Energy Center, you have similar outfits around the country that do this. The states are the ones really experimenting, trying to figure out how to make this work, making investments. The feds are really following. They're doing what they can. This administration's obviously done more than the one before, but the real leadership is at the state level. That's where the action is. That's where the rubber meets the road, where you're starting to see jobs being created, you see investment taking off. Having said that, there's a lot of, and this is more of the policy work. You have throughout the U.S., states mandating renewable policy. If you're what you've had before in terms of the class and renewable portfolio standards, that's a very major advance in terms of state policy making. In the past, energy was all about cost. Well, this has changed that. It's basically said, no, it's not all about cost. It's about environmental benefits, about job creation, it's about making an industry work. So 29 states have, it's really a majority of the population of the country under these kinds of laws. And a lot of states have set up these public funds that invest in these technologies, about $500 billion a year. This gets to sort of the money question. Jim knows this in spades, about how to get projects financed around the country. The problem is, and this is a quote from, he's actually no longer there, he's now the energy czar of New York, Richard Kaufman. But Richard's, when he was at Department of Energy, has basically said, we've set up this system of financing projects that's really kind of anachronistic. It's a 20 or 30-year-old system where you get tax credits, and it's a one-off scheme. It's very expensive, more expensive capital than there might be for things like roads and bridges, where we float bonds and it's long-term capital. It's a 20 or 30-year capital. You keep the costs down. Transaction costs aren't that high. So the way we do this today is not all that productive. So that's part of an issue. The other problem here in terms of money is, you know, through the stimulus package after the recession, that was probably the largest bump in federal money for clean energy that it has been that the country's ever seen. But what we're seeing now is this precipitous drop. It's about a 75% drop in federal support for clean energy. Again, just raises the stakes that we need to figure out a smarter way to figure out how to finance these technologies going forward. You can't count on Washington to save it. It's just not going to happen. Another big problem with clean energy is whether it's solar or wind. You know, solar is great during the day, wind's okay at night. The problem is, you know, that's not when people basically are putting the demand on the system. That's not when the loads are being created. This is actually, I think, this is the biggest problem we haven't even begun to figure out. This is a very immature industry. You know, if you're talking about batteries and all kinds of other early stage technologies to say, you know, how do you store that intermittent power that's generated from renewables? Unless you figure this out, you know, the value of all renewable technology is really quite small, and very insignificant. So you have to figure this out. This is the major stumbling block. We're not investing anywhere near what the federal government should be doing. We don't really have an idea of what the policies are. You know, California is starting to mandate this as a matter of course. You know, you have to make these investments in storage. But without this, this is probably the biggest nut to crack in this area. And we're not spending anywhere near the time, attention, and money to do it. Jim will talk about this. But you know, one of the big opportunities in the East certainly is offshore wind. OSW is offshore wind, and this is, you know, I see this as not just, you know, the Cape Wind project, which has gotten a hell of a lot of attention for good reasons, but as an industry creation exercise. I mean, you have the potential to create a new industry effectively up and down the East Coast, from Maine to the Carolinas, to produce renewable energy far in excess of anything you can do on the land. And that means, you know, a lot of jobs, it means a lot of demand for government, it means more reliable power right offshore, you know, in places like military bases. But we're just beginning to figure out what the policy is to do that. And right now it's a state-by-state play. Some states are stepping up and saying, you know, we need to support this in a specific way. We're going to pay more for it. Mass has done that through, you know, essentially mandating utilities here to buy power off of Jim's project and others. But this is, again, in a very early stage. We're trying to sort this out. What's the role of the states? What's the role of the federal government? What's the role of the private sector? How do you finance this stuff? This is a huge opportunity. A lot of moving parts. We're not even close to figuring this out. We're probably 10 years behind Europe, and that's, you know, that's not saying much. Europe's making progress, but they're nowhere near, you know, succeeding in this area either. Huge opportunities, big issues facing us. We're not close. Sandy and Irene before that, and then New Orleans before that. You know, we continue to do the same thing over and over and over again. A power crisis happens, you know, the trees are blamed or something's blamed, utilities, you know, and everybody forgets in a year or so. This is obviously going to keep happening. It's not going to be a problem that solves itself. We have to figure out how to kind of flip the energy system around so that we've got more localized distributed power in a serious way, targeting public facilities, critical infrastructure, hospitals, and other places, so that you've got power when you need it when this happens. I don't think you're going to solve it through, you know, better tree trimming or utility mandates. It's got to come about through a more disruptive system. And you know, one of the real problems here is that you've got crazy incentives. You know, if you may have seen, you know, after Sandy, probably read about this. You know, the NYU Medical School, their diesel generators were in the basement, and they were flooded, and the hospital went black. And right down the street, block away, Goldman Sachs building was perfectly lit throughout the entire crisis after the Sandy storm hit New York City. Why was that? You could be cynical and say it's because people know how to protect money and aren't very good at protecting people. And maybe not so cynical, because that's the case. I mean, the case is that if you're a data center, if you're a company that's protecting financial transactions, there is no limit of the amount of money you're going to spend to make sure you don't lose power. It's limitless, because you're talking about hundreds of millions of losses from a blip. Down the street, NYU Medical Center, you know, babies being intubated downstairs in a blackout. Luckily, nobody died. Same thing happened to Katrina. Exactly the same thing. You know, we've been down this road before, and states finally, I think, are starting to wake up to the idea that this is the permanent condition. And so, what do we do about that? And it really takes a different form of investment. It takes a different kind of policy to say, we're just not going to tolerate that, and we're going to change the system. We're going to turn this upside down. You know, the most pervasive form of local generation out there are diesel generators, which fail often, frequently, and they are there because they're required to be there, but they don't often work. We actually spent time with the NYU Medical Center 10 years ago and said, your system may not be working as well as you think it is. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. So, you know, I think it's time, maybe, and I think the states and the region are starting to wake up to this, that this is not going away. It's a permanent condition, and we've got to value these technologies for what they provide in terms of protection and life and property as well. I'm not going to get into the scale. I talked a little bit about the financing stuff before. One of the things we think is that if you look at how we finance infrastructure, you know, I'm almost finished. We're financing infrastructure. Basically, we do it because we float bonds. We're all familiar with bonds, you know, school bonds. But also, this is basically how you finance roads, bridges, hospitals, you know, a lot of public facilities around the country. We don't do that much at all to finance clean energy. So if you start thinking about energy as infrastructure, you know, something that's going to be around for a while, public good, produces revenue, and you've got federal money declining. There's only so much state money you can throw at this. That the bonding system starts to look fairly desirable. We've got a project going with the organization that represents all the bonding authorities around the country to start figuring this out, because they're interested in doing this too. They've looked kind of down the street and they say, well, you know, there's solar projects, there's wind projects, how do we get into this game? Because these are people who know how to finance trillions of dollars of investment and are starting to see this coming over the horizon. So it's actually a good thing. It's a good opportunity to see how you can start massaging the whole bonds are pretty boring, but how you can make this stuff work for the transition you need. Because you know, there's a mismatch. Right now, we've got, you know, very high transaction cost financing that probably isn't going to get us to that level that you need for climate stabilization. You need to get this stuff everywhere. You need to get these technologies to be pervasive. The amount of money is going to be in the trillions. And so this world, the bond finance world, knows how to raise trillions of dollars. I mean, this is just an example. These are, you know, municipal bond finance a month. You know, it's on a neighborhood of $70 or $80 billion a month that gets raised to finance everything you see. Probably a lot of this university was financed through bond offerings at one time or another. So there's a new world there to try to figure out how to get to scale, how to get to this new world. And finally, if anything's really working, the mafia will figure out how to get a part of it. I'm an Italian, so I can say that. But you go back, and this is what happens when you have a little bit too much public money, perhaps. But it turns out that most of the projects in Italy and wind were done in Sicily. And so it turned out to be kind of a money laundering operation, use of Italy's subsidy programs. But I just put it up there as an example that it's probably something that's here to stay. If if you have these folks looking at it as a long-term investment. So the idea that this is just a blip and then it's going to go away, I think is probably not the right approach. This is probably not the best example of saying that you know, it's here to stay, but I think it actually is. But we're just starting this. You know, this has been a new game for the last 15 or 20 years. There's going to be several generations of people who are going to have to figure this out. But you know, time's getting short. So thanks a lot.